What does it mean to preach the gospel? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. So today we're going to be handling this issue of preaching the gospel and how to preach the gospel. And I have a passage prepared for us. It's actually in the book of Romans. It's going to be in the first chapter. We're going to take a look at that. And I'm also going to show you some really cool Bible tools, online tools that are free that you can use in your study. And we're also going to be talking about chapter 15 and 16 of Romans. So we're going to stay in the book of Romans at the beginning and the end. And we're going to talk a lot about Paul. So this is sort of like our introduction to Paul, because I don't think we've really talked about the Apostle Paul on this YouTube channel yet. So this is kind of like a first time for everything type of thing. So it's going to be really fun today because, number one, we get to talk about Paul, the apostle, and we get to talk about the book of Romans. And we're going to be talking about preaching the gospel or how to preach the gospel. But before we get too far into this video, I just want to take a couple of seconds to tell you about my YouTube channel and why I think you should subscribe. First of all, this is a Bible study channel. What we do here is study the Bible because we take the Bible seriously and we seriously study the Bible. So if you are looking for a Bible study that's online, that's absolutely free, you just found it, and you can go ahead and click subscribe and the bell notification. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, my name is Adam Jordan Clark, and I publish a brand new video every single day. So now we're going to go jumping into this video, and we're going to look at two sources. We're actually going to talk about two internet sources. The first one's Bible Gateway, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and the other one is Bible Arc, which you might not be familiar with. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Greek New Testament. So that's actually pretty cool. So let me go ahead and show you what Bible Gateway looks like, and then I'll show you what the Bible Arc looks like. And they're both free websites, and they'll be linked below, so you can go ahead and link them. But I'll just give you a brief overview of these websites, so you can add them to your source catalog if you want to. So Bible Gateway is pretty easy to navigate. You pretty much just come up here, you type in your passage, you do get book list if you want, and you get the translations. I mean, there is a lot of translation that they have here available. I mean, if you speak Chinese, you can get a Chinese New Testament or Old Testament if you like. I prefer to use this button right here to select my translations, because when I use this button, or when you use this button, you don't have to click the search button over here. Another thing that's important to note about Bible Gateway that I find extremely useful is this button right here. It's called Add Parallel, and when you click it, here's what happens, actually. You click it, and it adds a parallel, which a parallel is another translation that you get to look at side by side. So on the left-hand side, we have the New American Standard, and on the right side, we just added the ESV, the English Standard Version. And if we wanted to change it to, I don't know, let's say the King James, well, we would put it to the King James. And one thing to notice here is that the New American Standard puts verses in the blocks, whereas the King James just does it verse by verse. So it's important to notice that in the King James. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Bible Arc. Bible Arc is a free website that you can use, and as you can see up here, it is meant for a deeper study of the Bible. And this is a very interesting website, because when we do come up here to Romans chapter 1, we can click the version that we want. I have the New American Standard opened up, and over here on the right side of your screen is the Greek. So if you want to know what Greek looks like, that's what it looks like, if you've never seen it before. And, you know, when it comes to the Bible, a lot of people always talk about mistranslations or something like that. And what's great about this particular tool, Bible Arc, is that you can come to a passage like Romans, or any passage for that matter, and you can look at the text side by side for yourself. And what's great about Bible Arc is that you can actually click on a word, and it'll show you what that word is. So the very first word that we have here is Paul. And when we look over here at the English, it says Paul. And we come over here, it says a slave, a male slave. What does it say here? A bound servant. And then this is Christ, or Messiah, or Anointed One. What does this have here? It says Christ, or Christ Jesus. And so we can just go down the list. But when we come down here to verse 16, I think that this is just such an important verse to highlight and talk about really quickly. Here's what it looks like in the Greek, by the way. Because it says very clearly, it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes." Now, what I want to point out about this passage is that it's in the first chapter, and it's verse 16. So it's not actually very far down the list. In other words, when you start reading the book of Romans, you don't get very far until you fall into this passage. Let me show you what I mean. When we scroll back up here to the top, we have his introduction that he gives, and then he talks about the church that he's writing to, the church in Rome. And then he starts giving thanks. He says, "I thank all you people, and I thank God, and I thank this, that, and the other." And then all of a sudden, he comes down here and makes this statement where he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Now, it's actually quite bizarre when you begin to think about it that way. He begins his letter, after he gets past the greetings and the introductions and everything, he begins the letter out by saying, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." And what's very interesting about that phrase is that when you consider the phrase, and this is a little bit tough to do because the book of Romans is 16 chapters. So it's a pretty big book, right? So doing this study takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on how diligent you are and how disciplined you are. So what you would do is you take that verse 16 where it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel," and you would write it down, and then you would read the gospel all the way through in one sitting. I'm sorry, read the book all the way through. It's not a gospel, it's a letter. Read the letter all the way through in one sitting. And you think about that phrase, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." And what you begin to realize when you do this study is that Paul's thesis, which a thesis is a claim, his claim seems to be that I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And we kind of ask ourselves this question: why is it that Paul's writing a letter that's 16 chapters long, is a very long book, and his whole point for writing it seems to be centered on him not being ashamed of the gospel? Why is that? Furthermore, when we get to the end of the book, chapter 15 and 16 tells us about him going to Jerusalem and taking the money that he collected from the other churches back to the apostles in Jerusalem in hopes that they'll receive his money. Why is that? And he also talks about going to Spain, and he's talking about coming to this church in Rome, which he had never been to. He talks about coming to this church in Rome, and he basically says, "Look, I'd like to see you guys on my way to Spain." And a lot of scholars think that maybe he's writing this letter because he wants to get this church to fund his missionary journey. I hold that position. I think that that's probably the most likely one, but there are many different reasons. So what I'm just to give you an idea of what we're kind of touching on here is the purpose for the writing of the book of Romans. And it seems to be that one of the purposes or one of the reasons why Paul wrote the letter to Romans is to say, "Hey, look, you guys in Rome, I want you to support my journey when I go to Spain. I need a church to fund me financially. So I want to come and see you. I want you to get to know me. I'm going to get to know you. And I want you to give me some money so I can go to Spain and preach the gospel." Furthermore, we got ourselves a little bit of a problem in chapter 3. I'll actually show you that really quickly. Down here in chapter 3, and we're back on Bible Gateway, by the way, but in chapter 3, verse 8, he has this very interesting phrase that very much stands out to us. And here's what it reads. It says, "And why not say, as we have slanderously reported, and some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come. Their condemnation is just." And so what's startling about this phrase is that he's talking about other people, and he's talking about what other people are saying, probably about him. And so the idea that we get as we read Romans all the way through, again, keep in mind, we're talking about coming off of the phrase in verse 16. I'll show you the phrase again. He says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." Oops, it's further down. He says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." And if we are to take this phrase, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel," and we read the gospel all the way through, and we start to notice that he's talking about other people, we see something very interesting that's going on in the book of Romans. And the short explanation as to what's going on is this. Paul was probably preaching grace so radically that people in the early church actually started to think that Paul didn't believe in God, or that he didn't believe in the law, if you will. You got to understand, the early church is a Jewish movement. It's not a Gentile movement. It's a Jewish movement, and Paul is the only one who's preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. Well, he's preaching grace so radically that people become upset with him. So when we come down to chapter 15, and we look at verse 22 down to 29, it actually goes a little bit further down here to the end. But basically what we see here is that he wants to go to Spain, and that he's going to Jerusalem to give some money to the saints who are in Jerusalem. Because back in those days, what Paul was doing is he went to all the churches that he established, and he collected an offering plate, and then he took that money back to Jerusalem to give to the apostles. Now, this is important to understand because what we know from Galatians, he talks about the pillars, or the so-called pillars. He often talks about himself being the lesser apostle. And right here in Romans, we clearly see what's going on. The church is established in Jerusalem, not in Rome. It's in Jerusalem. Okay, and James is probably the leader, not Peter. It's probably James. And so Paul is going around on these mission trips. He's setting up all these Gentile churches. Keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to the gospel. He's going around preaching the gospel to all these Gentiles. He collects money from all the churches he establishes, and then he goes back to Jerusalem. Now, obviously, he gets arrested in Jerusalem along with all the other apostles, and then he's taken to Rome eventually, and he's put to death. That's a topic for another time, but just know this is where this is Paul's probably one of his last letters that he's writing while he's in ministry before he gets arrested. But it's important to understand this phrase at the very beginning of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. What exactly is he referring to? Well, when we get all the way up to chapter 15, and we begin to realize, especially in chapter 3, I showed you in verse 8, when we begin to realize that there were a lot of Christians, or Jews, if you will, the early church really didn't like Paul. In fact, we see a little bit of a fight that happens in Galatians chapter 2. It's also recorded in Acts chapter 15. It's called the Jerusalem Council sometimes. And basically what we're seeing is that there is a fight that happens between the early Christians and Paul. And basically the idea that's happening here is a theological debate. Basically the Jews are saying, look, we should follow the law because Jesus didn't abolish the law. And Paul's saying, no, we're saved by grace. And so the early church was fighting over this. And the apostles in Jerusalem obviously had something to say about this. Now, obviously, we don't have any writings from them, so we're not really sure what they were actually saying particularly, but we know there was some type of a fight. And this fight actually went on for quite some time, that Paul writes an entire epistle to a church in Rome that he had never even been to, and he's writing to reassure them. He's saying, look, guys, I'm preaching the gospel, and I'm not ashamed of the gospel that I'm preaching. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ that sets people free. So I spent all this time to explain to you something very, very importantly. John Wesley and George Whitefield experienced the same exact thing back in the day when they were preaching the gospel. They came to a point in their life where they said, look, I'm going to preach the gospel because I know the gospel, and my own people aren't going to accept me. John Wesley and George Whitefield were kicked out of the church, and so that's why they went to the public square to start preaching the gospel. This is the same model that Paul left us. Paul says, look, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Even though my own people are rejecting me and they don't accept the gospel that I'm preaching, even the people who are calling themselves Christians in the early church movement, they're rejecting me and my message, but I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And he writes an entire epistle saying, hey guys, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. This is what the gospel is. It's a very incredible book. It's a very incredible thing, and it tells us a lot about Paul and what he believed and what he did in terms of ministry. My name's Adam Jordan Clark. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment below and tell me something interesting or maybe a really cool story. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification because I publish a brand new video every single day. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and as always, I will see you in the next video.